This is Brazil. It was a Portuguese colony from 1500 to 1822. Portugal was a small country, which made it difficult for it to maintain control over the geographically expansive Brazil. The main reason Portugal was able to retain its dominance over Brazil was because the Portuguese were deeply ingrained within Brazilian culture. Many Portuguese people lived in Brazil and ended up intermarrying with Brazilian natives, creating a large mestizo, or mixed population. Brazil did not have the same oppressive colonial relationship with Portugal that other Latin American colonies had with their mother countries. In fact, the Portuguese royal family even came to live in Brazil for 13 years. Due to the instability in Europe as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, the Portuguese royal court was forced to flee to Brazil, making Brazil the center of the Portuguese Empire. These 13 years were transformative for Brazil. Previously required to only trade with Portugal, the Portuguese opened Brazilian ports to foreign powers the world over, with England as a significant trading partner. In 1815, the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves was formed, effectively raising Brazil's status to that of Portugal. The Portuguese set about improving Brazil's infrastructure and society to reflect how they wanted the Portuguese Empire to be viewed by the world. This included road-building initiatives, the encouragement of internal trade, the printing of books and newspapers, and the establishment of schools. Rio de Janeiro had become an economic hotspot, and native Brazilians began to assume positions in higher government offices. However, at the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars and the restoration of the Portuguese monarchy, the royal court returned to Portugal. But Brazil could not go back to being a normal colony again. Brazilians wanted to keep their autonomy. The Brazilian independence movement, unlike its Latin American counterparts, was bloodless. The beloved heir to the Portuguese throne, who had grown up in Brazil after fleeing Portugal at 9 years old, Dom Pedro I, declared Brazil's independence on September 7, 1822. Dom Pedro I was the first emperor of Brazil. Brazil had gained its independence, but the hold Portugal still had on the fledgling country was fierce. It took about 3 years for Portugal to finally accept Brazil's autonomy, and it only did so after requiring Brazil to pay a £2 million indemnity. However clingy Portugal remained, Brazil's nation-building had begun. Brazil established itself as a constitutional monarchy, with Dom Pedro I as its emperor. There was much debate over, and fear of, the issue of patrimonialism, which meant there was a blurred distinction between private and public property of the emperor. Oftentimes, the emperor would consider the state his personal property, which allowed for vast corruption within the Brazilian government. There was also the issue of Brazil's being a unitary state, meaning it was governed by a single centralized power. Many feared that a too powerful government could become tyrannical, but others argued that due to Brazil's large territory, a strong centralized state was necessary to keep the country unified. And yes, Brazil was large and in need of a strong central government to hold it together, but how strong is too strong? This was the question that many Brazilians were asking with regard to the concept of moderating power for the emperor. Moderating power has its origins in the French Revolution, and it had made its way into the Brazilian government. The emperor was granted moderating power as a means of settling disputes between the branches of government and balancing power. But because it was the emperor who was granted this responsibility, it only reinforced the executive power in the Brazilian government. Another topic of political debate was federalism, or the separation of powers. Many Brazilians wanted to convert the centralized unitary state to a federal state. Now, Brazil was already split up into 18 provinces, but they had no political autonomy. The provinces simply represented geographic divisions. In 1824, there was a movement by a group of federalists called the Confederation of the Equator in support of republican principles and federalism. They feared the centralized Brazilian state and rose up in support of a republic, but the rebellion was quelled, just like the other unsuccessful attempts to make Brazil a republic. Although the rebellion was a plea for greater representation in government, that representation only included wealthy landowners, leaving Brazilian women and Africans to fend for their own rights. African slaves made up about 1/3 of Brazil's population and were integral to the Brazilian economy, so much so that Brazil ended up being the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas. 40% of Africans who survived the Middle Passage arrived in Brazil, and because slaves became increasingly associated with Africans, racist ideology developed. Brazil had an enormous demand for slave labor. With its large plantations, domestic responsibilities, and mining industry, slaves were integral to every part of Brazilian life, and international demand for Brazilian commodities increased demand for slaves. There was some minimal progress. Under the 1824 Constitution, free Afro-Brazilians were considered citizens and technically equal to free whites. Some even rose in status to become slaveholders on large plantations and even quelled slave rebellions as militiamen. However, most still suffered social prejudices. Women in Brazil received marginal improvement in their rights due to the strengthening of individualist ideas and increased literacy among elite women in the 19th century. Dynamic family structures challenged social norms, but there was still an emphasis on the man being the head of the household. A country founded upon ideals of independence and liberty, Brazil still had a ways to go.